Tom Skidmore was one of the most important scholars of Brazilian history in the United States to train generations of students. And in this regard, we're honored to have with us one of his students from Madison, Wisconsin, Joel Wolfe, who studies the impact of modernity, industrialism, and trade on Latin American societies and their politics. His primary focus is modern Brazil, and his most recent publication was Autos in Progress, The Brazilian Search for Modernity, Oxford 2010. He also published Working Women, Working Men, São Paulo and the Rise of Brazil's Industrial Working Class, 1900 to 1955, by Duke University Press, 1993. And his articles have appeared in the Latin American Research Review, the Hispanic American Historical Review, Radical History Review, Luso Brazilian Review, and the Revista Brasileira de História. He is presently working on a book tentatively titled The Global Twenties, Trade and Society in the Western Hemisphere in the 1920s. And we're really honored to have Joel with us. He's been a great colleague. He's at the University of Massachusetts Amherst as a professor, where he has trained excellent undergraduate students who have come on to our program. Sandra Haley, Tammy Almeida, and Dan McDonald are three of the people he has kind of given us, and we're really glad that we were get such high caliber students for our graduate program. But he's also been a really wonderful scholar and a friend of Brown University, and so it was really appropriate to invite him to give the first Memorial Skidmore lecture. Joel.
Thanks, Jim, and it is a real honor to be here. I just have to fix this. I think my computer is going to keep doing things in the middle of my slides, so I just want to see what else is open. I don't think you want to read my email. Or maybe you do. So anyway, thank you so much for turning out. You know, I know that you had the former president of Brazil here on Monday, and you know, I thought a lot about that and sort of my place coming after her, and I thought that, you know, to be Brazilian, if she was the feijoada, then I'm that little cup of espresso that you have afterwards, because you really can't take much more, but you want to hang out and have a conversation. So I think maybe that's the appropriate metaphor for following someone as extraordinary and significant, and from what I hear from everyone who met her, really lovely as Jill. I want to start by saying, I mean, I have notes, I'm going to read my notes, but this is, when Jim asked me to do this, you know, I didn't want to present you, you know, like archival research and something narrow. I wanted to try to say something broad about Brazil, in part to honor Tom. So these are just some thoughts I have about thinking spatially about Brazil and situating Brazil in the hemisphere. So I want to thank Jim, who is a dear friend and colleague in the Department of History in the Watson Institute, and the Brazil Initiative here at Brown, which is really an extraordinary thing and something you should all thank your lucky stars you're part of. And I'm particularly honored to deliver the inaugural Thomas Skidmore Memorial Lecture. Now, when Jim invited me here, he asked me very diplomatically, as one does with an old friend, to make sure that I spoke about Brazil. And that may seem odd. I went to the University of Wisconsin explicitly to work with Tom and also with Florencia Malin and Steve Stern, but I went to work on Brazil. And my dissertation became my first book, which Jim mentioned, on Sao Paulo, and I've written more articles about Getulio Vargas than I could probably count. In fact, I owe Oxford University Press a blog post about Getulio Vargas. I'm not really sure how one writes a blog post about Getulio Vargas, but I agreed to it. I was flattered. My second book, as Jim mentioned, is a reinterpretation of modern Brazil through automobility. I understand some of you have read it. If you enjoyed it, that's great. If not, take that up with Oxford. I don't give refunds. But the reason Jim asked me to focus on Brazil is I am now writing this book about the entire hemisphere. And I think he kind of quietly worried that I might go off on a tangent about the export of asbestos from Quebec or the 1919 EDGE Act, which was key in allowing US foreign branch banking in Latin America. So I know you all want to hear more about that, and we can talk about that later. Obviously we won't. What I'd like to talk about is Brazil's great size and its geography and how that geography has shaped its modern history. And my thesis is very basic and straightforward. It's that Brazil's massive size is not just the context for understanding its history of regionalism and a weak central state. It's a driver of those things. And so I am saying something that people said in the 19th century in a very different and very racist way, and I don't mean it to be like that, but I'm saying that Brazil's geography really was, in many ways, its destiny. And it's important to ask if this is a new idea, and is it important? And interestingly, what I'll tell you is it's actually a very old idea that comes from some of the first writings in what we could call the modern historiography of Brazil. And yes, I think it's important, and I hope to kind of prove that. So there's Brazil, right? Brazil dominates South America. We all know that. But I think it's important to demonstrate its sheer size with a map that appeared first in Brad Burns' History of Brazil and then later in Tom Skidmore's book that many of you have seen. And that's Europe fitting comfortably within the borders of Brazil. Now, from the earliest days, the Portuguese were really not that clear what they were going to do about Brazil. And this is a picture of the so-called captaincies, which were the colonial units. And Patricia Seed, who was my colleague when I taught at Rice, wrote a really brilliant book called Ceremonies of Possession, that some of you may know. And what she talked about in this book is the ways that different European powers took the land in this hemisphere. And so the English, right, we're here in New England, the English would say, you know, you get from that rock to that tree to that river. The Spanish in Mexico initially gave grants of people, right, the encomienda, people to be Christianized. The Brazilians, the great seafaring people who really had no idea what they had, stood on the coast and used a sextant and marked off territory and said, you have from here to there until the end of the world. Right? So this was the sort of original sin of how Brazil was settled. Now, that's not to say that the Portuguese did not open new lands. They often did so in response to economic opportunities. But the Portuguese famously, the line was they hugged the coast like crabs for much of the colonial era. They did put some new lands into sugar production, and they moved inland at first, chasing gold and diamond. Well, you don't really chase it, you dig it up. Gold and diamonds in present-day Minas Gerais. Now, I can't on my computer see what's the next, so I hope this is, it is right. It's the Minas, the Minas slide. There won't be any slides of my dog. I've double-checked to make sure I took the personal ones out. Indeed, they moved the capital from the northeast to Rio, in part, to have their meager governmental presence closer to this major new source of revenue. The rise of the center-south, at first through mining, but later through agriculture, did attract more Portuguese people than had previously been in the area. The development of the cattle economy along the São Francisco River, as well as the penetration of indigenous lands in Sao Paulo, were long ago studied by some of Brazil's pioneering historians. And as I said, this is a long ago told but largely forgotten story. Brazil's massive size was first noted by perhaps Brazil's first modern historian, João Capistrano de Abreu. His Capítulos da História Colonial, published in 1907, explicitly discusses these issues, and then more to the point, his later book, Caminhos Antigos e Povoamento do Brasil, the Old Roads and the Peopling of Brazil, which traces the cattle economy along the São Francisco River, specifically focus on the importance of Brazil's geography. Sergio Buarque de Holanda is likewise one of the founders of modern Brazilian historiography. I wrote, he's best known for 1936 Raízes do Brasil, but then I couldn't help myself and wrote, he's also very well known as the father of Chico Buarque. And I think sadly he's probably better known as the father of Chico Buarque. But he wrote Raízes, which is many people consider the single finest book in Brazilian history, at least produced in that era. And he later wrote a book called Caminhos Sem Fronteiras, which was about the cultural aspects of the penetration of the interior of Sao Paulo. The point here is that this topic was recognized early on by the people who founded the field. There are, however, very understandable reasons why this topic is not part of the discussion today. I think the most important has to do with the fact that one of the two big issues in the Brazilian historiography, and there are lots of them, are slavery and national politics, the struggle between dictatorship and whatever is not dictatorship, and sometimes democracy. So looking at slavery, the issue is really the nature of Brazilian slavery, or the so-called slave question in Brazil, and how it compares to the other very geographically big slaveholding society in the Western Hemisphere. Despite the presence of slavery in New England and the Middle Atlantic states and the longevity of slavery in New York's Hudson River Valley, slavery in the United States was sectional. And that was exacerbated by the structure of the US government. The Senate was made up of slave and free states. The House was lopsided in empowering the South through the 3/5, it is 3/5, right? Yeah, the 3/5 compromise. I'm a Brazilianist. Although there are many terrific community studies of slavery, the nature of US slavery has more of a national gauge. If you think about the really famous big books about slavery and its aftermath, and I'm not endorsing Eugene Genovese's Roll, Jordan, Roll, it's a problematic book, but it has a national focus. Leon Litwack's been in the storm so long, likewise, a national focus on the aftermath of slavery. Even Edmund Morgan's American Slavery, American Freedom, which is ostensibly about Virginia, is really about the question of freedom and slavery in the Americas. And if you look at the really great books, the classics, I'm not going to talk about recent historiography, in Brazil, two come to mind. My favorite is Stanley Stein's Vassouras, a coffee county. A coffee county. It is a micro study. It is a brilliant study. It's a wonderful book that holds up 60 years later. Amir Viotti da Costa's Pathbreaking, Da Senzala a Colonia, is a study of Sao Paulo. Studying slavery is for 19th century Brazilian history absolutely fundamental, but these studies are local. Even think about Tom's book, Black and White, which is not about slavery, it's about race thought. And he does cover many parts of Brazil, but he isn't thinking, nor should he really in this book, about geography. The other major topics in Brazilian history have a hyperlocal focus. If you think about labor history, they're almost always about cities, individual industries. And then with the labor laws in the 1930s, the actual unit of measure is the municipio, the town or the city. I can think of two great works of national scope in Brazilian history that we should talk about today, that Jim already mentioned, Tom Skidmore's two books. And neither of those would necessarily talk about geography. So it's perfectly understandable why the Brazil historiography has largely ignored the nation's geography. But that doesn't mean that we should continue to allow this lacuna to exist. Adding geography back in, I think, can change the way we look at Brazilian history. And I just want to warn you, I am very much a 20th centuryist. So when I say look at Brazilian history, I mean look at the 20th century. Having said that, the colonial era, I think, is kind of easy to understand in geographical terms. It serves as a foreshadowing of how independent and even modern Brazil would function as a disconnected whole. Settlement and conquest were always reactive, not only to new economic activities, but to real and perceived foreign threats. Perhaps the easiest way to understand the profound impact of Brazil's geography on both the colonial period and the developing sense of nation is to think about really its most important independence struggle, the Inconfidência Mineira. First of all, it was an independence movement influenced by the American Revolution and French liberal thought, but it was only in Minas. It had no national gaze. Despite being openly influenced by the Enlightenment and the United States, there was not an attempt to bring in other thinkers, other people from other states. Indeed, when we think geographically, we can see that the empire and the republic were part of a clear continuum. There were obviously important changes in the 1822 to 1930 period. Sergio Buarque de Holanda famously commented on the Golden Law ending slavery, quote, "The year 1888, the most decisive year in the evolution of the Brazilian people, divides two epochs." And he's right, certainly. And Brazil in 1822 and 1930 looked very different. But thinking geographically, Brazil was more alike than different at the start and end of that period. Indeed, we could define the long 19th century, or we talk about the long 19th century, as beginning with the Pombaline reforms and ending with the onset of the Great Depression. And it was defined more than anything else by the production and export of commodities, but in ways that deepened regionalism and literally disincentivized the nation from building a unifying infrastructure. Commodities left ports in Belém, in Salvador, Rio, Santos, Porto Alegre, and other coastal cities, building ties to foreign markets, but not to each other. At this point, it's worth saying, well, okay, that's just sort of natural. You're a commodity producer. Wouldn't that happen? But if you compare this to other nations in the hemisphere, it didn't happen that way because of geography. The most obvious case is, of course, Argentina. And I would never in a million years argue that Argentina did not have tremendous conflict between the Pampas and the port. But it's an obvious example of a commodity exporter whose internal movement of goods and people tied the nation together in ways that were politically fraught. 19th century clashes between the Pampas and Porteños show the incredible pull of this movement of wheat and beef. Mexico, of course, had two trade axes that solidified the place of Mexico City not only politically but economically. The colonial era Veracruz to Acapulco east-west trade continued, and Veracruz remained so important in terms of trade that it was literally seized by the European powers to pay off war debts. I'm going to talk a little bit more about tariffs later, but which port would you seize if you were to do that in Brazil? I mean, maybe Santos, but it's not obvious. It was really obvious in Mexico. These trade patterns, and Porfirian development, and I mean, I know no one can read this, but if you're veering to the right, the big hub there is Monterrey. Porfirian development deepened these tendencies. These trade patterns helped foster strong central governments in Argentina and Mexico. And when I say Mexico, I mean beginning in the Porfirian period, when the trade is robust. The The absence of similar patterns deepened Brazilian regionalism both during the Empire and Republic. Indeed, the Republic's experiences with the political tug of war between Minas Gerais and Sao Paulo, a política de café com leite, the politics of coffee with milk, was somewhat static. In other words, it was Sao Paulo doing its thing, Minas doing its thing. It wasn't the coming together of goods or people. This Brazilian rivalry was based on existing economies and trade patterns, rather than being fostered by trade and migration. And this isn't a particularly good map, but you can see, and it's not completely clear, but you can see that in general, everything is moving towards the coast. So rather than engage in counterfactual histories about how Brazilian history might have unfolded had it had more navigable rivers or geography that concentrated power in a capital city similar to Buenos Aires or Mexico City, it's simply a fact that Brazil's long 19th century was a period of weak national integration and extreme regionalism. Brazil's massive size and unique trade patterns shaped both monarchical and republican politics that privileged local control and precluded the establishment of infrastructure projects that might foster national unification. Indeed, when we consider the nation's largest nations, the hemisphere's largest nations, Brazil stands out as the one that eschewed such integration. While the United States was blessed with a river system that tied the hinterland to the coast, it had an impulse for infrastructure that goes way back. As much as the Mississippi drained commodities from the Midwest to the port of New Orleans, the building of the Erie Canal allowed a new access down the Hudson River into New York City. But an even bigger difference between the United States, Canada, and even Mexico on the one hand, three geographically large countries in the hemisphere, and Brazil, was railroad construction. Railroads in Brazil, as you saw in the previous map, did very little to connect various cities. The big point, I mean, veering from it a little bit, is that Belém is sending rubber outward, Santos is sending coffee outward. There isn't a line of communication between the Amazon, an Amazonian port, and a port in the state of Sao Paulo like Santos. Now, railroads did have an economic impact. Bill Summerhill's work on this shows that it lowered costs, it decreased friction, it aided productivity, but it did not lead to economic or political integration. The United States, Canada, and even Mexico built transcontinental railroads that were as much symbolic forms of national unification as they were infrastructure projects. They were vague military and economic justifications. As Richard White has demonstrated in his book Railroaded, that the transcontinentals in the United States were often more about stock and bond manipulation than they were about moving goods. But the fact of the matter is they did involve unification through infrastructure. There's a reason train stations have names like Union Station. They were to tie the Union together. And those countries, like Brazil, are federal republics, places where the states have a lot of political authority. And so the 20th century economic policy in those nations was quite different from Brazil's. I just want to show you that's American railroads by 1890. Those were just the major ones before. Road building and rural electrification in the United States were more robust and centrally planned. Even internal migration, both in the Great Migration and the movement of Okies escaping the Dust Bowl to California, took place through lines of communication that had previously unified the nation. The Grand Trunk Railroad in Canada and the growth of the Canadian Pacific Line, as well as the eventual construction of the St. Lawrence Seaway, played a similar role. And as early as the Porfiriato, the central government in Mexico coordinated development policies among the states, from irrigation projects in the north to the forced removal of the Yaqui to faraway Yucatan. The few excuse me. We'll get to Vargas in a second. The few national interventions into Brazil's interior were in response to social or political upheaval. At Canudos in the 1890s, the Contestado in the 1910s, and the Pursuit of the Prestes column in the 1920s. And military and civilian accounts of movement into the interior to quell those rebellions makes clear that the near total absence of lines of communication from the coast made these completely separate places. Military accounts of both the Contestado rebellion and the Pursuit of the Prestes column detail the great social and economic divide between the coast and spaces that seemed all but unknown to the military and urban elites. One cannot read Euclides da Cunha's classic account of Canudos and his almost neurotic description of the land and people of the interior without sensing that this Carioca felt, this person from Rio de Janeiro, felt as if he were on a completely different planet. And I do think it's significant that the title of his classic book in Portuguese is not Rebellion in the Backlands. It's Os Sertões, right? He's talking about the land. Another point of comparison between the two of the hemisphere's geographically largest nations in the late 19th and early 20th century involves immigration from Europe. just Europeans for a minute. European immigrants in the United States went to and stayed in urban areas for a variety of reasons. Now, there were some people who embraced farming. I can tell you, I grew up in fabulous South Jersey, not far from Vineland. And Vineland, New Jersey is known for two things. It's where Mike Trout played Little League Baseball, and it's filled with Jewish chicken farmers. And the expression Jewish chicken farmer does not usually come off people's lips discussing the United States. So there are some European immigrants from the 1890s and early 20th century who went to the rural sector, but the vast majority of Europeans filled eastern and midwestern cities. In Brazil, European immigrants largely went to work in agriculture, not only in Sao Paulo, but populating the south of Pará, Santa Catarina, and Rio Grande do Sul. In fact, one can read of Jewish farmers in Rio Grande do Sul much more often than reading about Jewish farmers in the United States. The point is that as late as the early 20th century, Brazil was still seeking to populate in order to gain control over its hinterland. European immigration to Brazil deepened the concentration of wealth in the center and south. While in the United States, European immigrants of this era played a central role in depressing industrial wages in the Northeast and Midwest, and so increased US productivity. They did that, and they spread economic development throughout the land. Now, given all this, and given the fact that Brazilian politics had deviated from those of the rest of the Western Hemisphere. Now, I want to say when I wrote that, I knew what I was thinking. I wrote it, but I didn't think it would be clear to you. So when I say that Brazilian politics deviated from those of the Western Hemisphere, I don't mean on the big macro question of dictatorship or democracy. What I mean is the actual public policy, what governments were doing, no matter the structure of the government. Public policy in Brazil was very, very different from the rest of the hemisphere. And given that, I think we need to read the ascension of Getulio Vargas and the Revolution of 1930 as an attempt to alter that course and to create a modern and unified nation. But my point is that we need to read the revolution as an even bigger break than is normally considered. This reading of the Vargas years is not completely new, and many see the revolution as a rupture, although there are people who claim it represents continuity. I still don't understand that argument. It's the nature and meaning of that break that I seek to clarify. I've argued in previous work that Vargas was ultimately Brazil's first modernist leader, and I stand by that. But I want to dissect that a little bit by looking at Brazilian geography. We have to start by challenging the conventional wisdom about Vargas. He's understood to be a centralizer. I believe he failed in that, but much of what he did that was important allowed future leaders to use the things he had created to help centralize power in the national capital, first Rio and then Brasilia. He's also understood to have created a vast array of social services and benefits for working people. As I think I've demonstrated in other writings, this simply isn't true. Perhaps the single fact I can give you to dispel the notion of Getulio Vargas as the so-called father of the poor who mobilized and rewarded labor is that almost immediately after he was removed from office in 1945, wildcat strikes broke out demanding dramatic increases in pay to try to recoup some of people's losses at the hands of Vargas's wage squeezes. Indeed, Vargas returned to the presidency as a populist in 1951, but he faced ongoing opposition from workers who continued to strike and organize outside the formal industrial relations system. I don't have time to go into all the ways Vargas failed to deliver real benefits to working people or even bring large numbers of people into the state, but I can assure you that by almost any measure, Vargas addressed the social question more in favor of industry and elites than on behalf of working people. But I do think that we can look at something like the creation of the Ministry of Labor as an example of Vargas's most significant contributions to Brazil. Now, I just contradicted myself. But people say he created the Ministry of Labor and that he brought people in. That's not my argument. My argument is that the Ministry of Labor was one of the first things in Brazil beyond the military and the post office that was national in scope. It had a nominal presence anywhere people were in unions, because unions were organized by municipio, town or city. It was not particularly effective. The ministry did not have a great impact on national unification at first, but it created the structure for it to gain control over it. In other words, when we look at Vargas, we have to understand Vargas was the most important figure in Brazil from 1930 to 1954. And at the same time, elsewhere in the Western Hemisphere, leaders were creating or expanding major new social welfare and reform programs. Vargas was most successful in addressing Brazil's great size, weak national government, and absent national infrastructure. Recall that in the 1930 to 54 period, other nations in the hemisphere succeeded, at least in the near term, in implementing programs that addressed directly popular needs. This is true of Franklin Roosevelt and Harry Truman. It's true of William Lyon Mackenzie King and the Liberals in Canada. It's certainly true at least for 6 years in Mexico during Lázaro Cárdenas' rule, for a decade of Popular Front governments in Chile, and whatever one thinks of Juan Perón, he did in fact deliver the goods, at least for the first 5 or 6 years of his government. Vargas was too busy trying to assert Rio's control over the nation to be able to implement effective social programs or an agrarian reform. I mean, the absence of any talk of an agrarian reform during Vargas's years is something no one talks about because it's absent, right? But its absence is worth noting. In fact, it's an incredible aside from what I'm discussing, but Vargas's biggest spending during his administration was to prop up coffee, not to have an agrarian reform. So he tried at first to assert centralized control through the interventors and the establishment of the Ministry of Labor. But that failed for a variety of reasons. And the most spectacular reason was the civil war launched by Sao Paulo in 1932. Sao Paulo is the richest, most powerful state. And if one were to go to the military archives and read the reports of the generals who fought against Sao Paulo, they thought they were going to lose. They thought that Sao Paulo could actually win the war. Something that very few people understand is that part of the deal between Vargas and Sao Paulo after nominally winning was that Vargas promised that Sao Paulo state could be responsible for all federal government activities in its state. It was an extreme moment of federalism for Sao Paulo alone. So right there you can see the limits of what Vargas could do, given that Sao Paulo was alone. But the main fact here is that Vargas had to put the cart before the horse. He didn't have state capacity to do the sorts of things that people in Canada, the United States, even Mexico, Chile, and Argentina could. And I say even because obviously Mexico, Argentina, and Chile were not as wealthy as the United States and Canada. Building state capacity would be arduous. Another really boring topic that no one talks about because it's really boring. Well, I actually wrote a book that involved maybe the most boring topic ever, and that's road building, right? And I tried not to. There are two things when you write about road building. One, don't be too detailed because no one cares. And two, avoid bad metaphors. Concrete, going down that path, the road to, etc. But the other thing that's really even more boring and gives me a headache, even though I got a refund, is taxes. Brazil didn't have a rational system of national tax collection that it would need to fund any sort of program. In fact, individual states controlled many tariffs. And this deepened ties between the sites of commodity production and the consumers of those commodities abroad. And just think for a moment, anyone who knows any US history, I know a little US history, when you say the tariff, you're talking about perhaps the single most important political issue from Reconstruction to the Great Depression. Tariffs funded the national government and protected industry. It shaped the American economy. Brazil did implement a modest tariff to promote textile production in 1890, and when it faded, finally Sao Paulo took over and had a state-based tariff. Sao Paulo also famously financed the 1906 coffee valorization because Rio didn't have the ability or interest in doing it. The Ministry of Labor is a minor success for Vargas because it's self-funding. Everyone has to pay the union tax, and that money goes from Rio back to the local level. So Vargas did create the bureaucratic architecture for central state control in the Ministry of Labor, but he had more concrete success, or he laid the groundwork for more concrete success when it came to the moving of people around Brazil. In 1937, he organized the first Brazilian governmental attempt to settle the interior with the so-called March to the West. The national government sponsored the movement of people and the building of towns in the center and west states of Goiás, Mato Grosso do Sul, and Tocantins, and north in the Amazon region in the states of Acre, Amazonas, Amapá, Rondônia, and Roraima. Now, those weren't all states at the time. The idea was to fill spaces that were imagined to be empty and to make them into Brazilian places. The March to the West would make these sparsely populated areas developed and hopefully look more like the center-south of Sao Paulo, Minas, and Rio. Road building and town making were requirements for the March to the West, but they were beyond the abilities of the federal government. Such programs typically depend on the transfer of wealth via national taxes from richer states, and Brazil did not have the capacity or the will to do that. Sao Paulo had gone to war against any level of control. It certainly wasn't going to finance road building outside its state. FDR had a national tax system that allowed him to do things like the Tennessee Valley Authority and Public Works. In fact, one of the funniest things I've ever read about taxes, many funny things, but the DuPonts were a major force behind ending prohibition. And it wasn't because they liked getting drunk, it was because they hated the income tax. And they thought once prohibition was gone, and the federal government had alcohol taxes, it wouldn't need the income tax. And when FDR was elected, DuPont's head exploded because he thought, here's a liberal who's going to have both, right? Because Prohibition ends in 1933. So FDR, despite the depressed economy in the United States, has a system of generating revenue from people to the government into programs. Juan Perón famously taxed agricultural exports to fund urban social programs and to depress food prices, and therefore raise the standard of living. But the march to the West began really for the first time in Brazilian history, the process of the national government moving into the hinterland. Juscelino Kubitschek continued this work with his ambitious 50 Years of Progress in 5, and road building was a big part of that. During the 1964 to 85 military dictatorship, the administration of Emilio Medici established the Programa de Integração Nacional, the National Integration Program, and I'll talk a little bit more of that in a minute, which specifically funded road building and town building like that laid out by Vargas. But Vargas wasn't done. In addition to the march to the West, he also revived the Federal Inspectorate for Works to Combat Droughts, which probably wasn't very popular because it had a terrible name, IFOX. It had been created in 1906, and it finally had an infusion of funds in the early 1920s when there was a northeastern president of Brazil, I think the only northeastern president at the time, Epitácio Pessoa. But Vargas refunded this Mormon program specifically to try to alter the political and economic geography of the Northeast. He did other things that relate to this, maybe not at first blush, but I think they do. He created Petrobras. This may not seem as though it's related to Brazil's spatial development, but it was more than simply about national pride in resource extraction. The original goals involved developing advanced production facilities in the Brazilian Northeast, and the national oil industry would facilitate the ongoing push in automobility. One more Vargas innovation that does not seem at first to be related to the nation's geography and uneven development was the founding of the National Steel Complex at Volta Redonda. Its primary goal was to facilitate further industrialization, particularly of consumer durables, by breaking the supply bottleneck created by importing steel. But Vargas placed the steel company in a unique and symbolically important location. It's located in Rio State, right near the borders of Sao Paulo and Minas. Putting Volta Redonda there not only spurred further industrial development in these three states, it tied them together economically in ways that they had not been. In other words, before it was just these places sending products abroad. Now it's Volta Redonda sending steel to these other places that are making what we call consumer durables, electrodomésticos and automobiles, and selling them in Brazil. It's important to understand how badly connected these areas were. And some of you who read my book know a little bit about this. Minas had a road connecting Rio in the 19th century, the famous União and Indústria, which connected Juiz da Fora to Petrópolis, not even Rio de Janeiro, but the city of Petrópolis. And then the Auto Club of Rio privately financed a road in 1920 to connect Petrópolis to the city of Rio. This road is actually discussed in the movie Notorious. It's how you're going to bump someone off. The road is considered so bad. It's a Hitchcock movie. But the point here is that there's so little road building in the 1920s that a private group of rich car owners have to fund the building of a road. But the connections between Rio and Sao Paulo were even worse. In 1912, it took 34 days to drive between Brazil's two largest and most important cities. 9 years earlier, in the United States, an American, in a less good car, an American drove from Oakland, California to New York City in 63 days. Rio and Sao Paulo are 433 kilometers apart today, and you can drive the Via Dutra, in under 6 hours. Oakland to New York City is 4,667 kilometers, and if you drove straight and had an endless supply of gas, you could do it in 42 hours. Sao Paulo did build a road to the Rio border in 1920, but the Rio government did not have the money to complete it. So these areas were not well connected. But there was even more symbolism to Volta Redonda. It is built in land that had once produced coffee, the very area that Stanley Stein studied. So this was an example of a kind of modern industrial complex taking over, producing for domestic consumption, although now Volta Redonda exports worldwide, but producing for domestic consumption exactly where the kind of classic commodity export had been. There are many more examples, some quite minor and others a little bit more significant, that show Vargas's concern with Brazil's spatial development. On the minor side, something that perhaps interests only me, he promulgated the nation's first unified traffic code. In terms of symbolic politics, despite his nationalist developmentalism, he supported and even visited Henry Ford's plantations in the Amazon. He was a major proponent of the development of the national, there he is planting a rubber tree, the national aviation industry in Brazil. And he worked closely with Franklin Roosevelt during World War II to help develop both Amazon and the Northeast. Now, this was American military bases, but it had long-term impacts. Perhaps the best way to evaluate the impact of Vargas's focus is to note how much he shaped not only Juscelino Kubitschek's Targets program in the 1950s, but also those of the military dictatorship. JK, as he was known, prioritized a mobile, nationally dispersed form of developmentalism. The national automobile industry is the most obvious example of this. But Brasilia was an equally obvious form of spatially oriented national policy. The capital was metaphorically in the middle of the nation. It's not physically in the middle of the nation. And was seen as a major factor in the moving of people and economic activity out of Brazil's center-south. The accompanying large-scale road-building program was yet another component of Kubitschek's spatially oriented national policy making, as was the creation of the Superintendency for the Development of the Northeast, or SUDENE, which was just the next stage in the development of such a spatial policy that had begun with Vargas's refunding of IFOX. But it's also quite a bit of the Brazilian military's developmentalism that has its roots in Vargas's template. Medici's Programa de Integração Nacional was the colonization of the Amazon. It required massive road building and the establishment of new towns and cities. Medici had called the PIN, as the program was known, quote, the solution to two problems, men without land in the Northeast and land without men in the Amazon. Now, the second part is, of course, ludicrous. There were men and women in the Amazon, but they were indigenous people. As much as the development of the Amazon was a military program for mobility, so too was the development of the national ethanol program during the administration of Ernesto Geisel. This, like Volta Redonda, tied Brazil's traditional agricultural sector to modernity, specifically to mobility and movement, and brought great federal subsidies to the hinterland. Now, when I was finishing my book, Autos in Progress, I used to joke that it was a shame that Brazilians embraced the symbol of the airplane for national unification and not the car. Because if they had chosen the car, then Brasilia wouldn't look like an airplane, it would look like a car, and I'd have a really cool cover for my book. Now, we tend to look at, so this is the shape of it, the satellite pictures of Brasilia show the same thing. We tend to look at Brazil's obsession with flight as a sort of hangover from the long-held but clearly debunked belief that Santos Dumont had invented the airplane. Air travel is an obvious tool for dealing with Brazil's massive size and now highly dispersed population. And it's highly dispersed, by the way, I couldn't go into detail, I would bore you to tears, because of all of those things that Vargas and Kubitschek and the military did. They allowed for the growth of intermediate towns in the interior, and even some big cities. But air travel and the development of national television networks, and even Brazil's early embrace of the internet, early by Global South standards at least, are about more than what they're obviously about. In other words, each of these things serve distinct economic and/or commercial purposes, but they're also part of a unique national history about moving beyond the coast and the center-south of Rio, Sao Paulo, and Minas. Other geographically big nations in the hemisphere have histories shaped by expansion, conquest, and migration, and the construction of ever more sophisticated communications and transportation networks. But those other countries' conquest, settlement, immigration, and migration shaped their political and economic geographies. In other words, geography in much of the hemisphere, particularly in the larger countries, has been more context than anything else. But Brazil's been different. Given Brazil's size and distinct geography, and given its patterns of initial conquest and settlement, and its long 19th century of extraction without unification, the taking of commodities and tying commodity production to areas where they are consumed rather than tying parts of Brazil together. Given all of that, Brazil's geography has been more of a driver of the nation's history than merely its context, making its colonial 19th and 20th centuries distinct in significant ways from the histories of other nations of the hemisphere. Thank you very much.
Well, feel free to field the questions.
Yeah, what did you say? Yeah, right. That's what I was going to do. I'm now fielding questions. Forgive me for reading it. I tend not to read my lecture notes. At least 3 people can attest to that. But I just wrote this, so it's very new to me. Young Tammy.
I was wondering if you could speak a little bit about the theoretical groundings to your work and your thinking of spatial history.
That's a really great question. And we should reveal, much like cable television, I had that question ahead of time. But when you asked me this earlier, I told you I didn't know what it was, and I had to think about that. And I think that the geographer who most influenced me is David Harvey, and Harvey's understanding of the spatial components of capitalism. And I think what's so interesting about Harvey's work, and if you read it along with the great English geographer Dory Massey, Harvey's English too, that Harvey tends to think, not always, but he tends to think internationally, spatially internationally. And I'm trying to think of Brazil in that same context, and Massey, I think, does a nice job of that. So their work on the uneven nature of capitalism is really, particularly Harvey's, is behind this. But as I said, when I think about Mexico, and when I think about Argentina, and even you can say this about Chile with Valparaiso, you just sort of think of things being funneled someplace and how that connects the nation, and that there is something unique about Brazil where everything just seems to be going out. So the idea in my head, which isn't a theoretical idea, is that a coffee planter, well, I'll give you an example. I know someone whose father is a very wealthy, very corrupt right-wing soybean, that's redundant, right? Soybean farmer in the south of Brazil. And years and years ago, when I first met him, he had satellite TV, so he could watch CNBC because his entire worldview was what was going on in the Midwest of the United States relative to the price of soybeans in China. And to me, even though that was in the 1990s or 80s, that replicated what I think went on, that people in Manaus and Belém knew about the rubber market, but knew nothing about what was going on in Sao Paulo. People in Sao Paulo knew about the price of coffee in Frankfurt, in New York, and New Orleans, but really knew nothing about Salvador. And that's the sort of sense that everything was just from those places out, and that led to a uniquely uneven kind of capitalism. That changed, that then forces Vargas to have a politics that's going to be unlike anything else going on in the hemisphere. Yeah.
So a couple of points. So one is you frame this as a Brazilian exceptionalism, but if you read, for instance, Frank Safford's book for Colombia of a divided land fragmented society,
Right.
like a lot of the arguments are common. So I was wondering how much of this is like a Latin American thing,
Right.
and how much of this is a Brazilian thing. And then the other thing is that you mentioned in the 19th century that there wasn't much of a nation-building effort, and I was wondering what was the role of the War of the Triple Alliance, because I mean that A, expanded Brazilian territory,
Right.
and then B, was a huge national enterprise. So I was wondering if that created some
Right.
Brazilianness.
Okay, those are both good questions. So Frank Safford's book, I have to admit, I've never read. Nancy Applebaum has sent me her new book, which is on this, that is sitting on my desk unread. So it could be that Colombia is more like Brazil than it's, because I don't think it's Latin American. I do think that Argentina and Chile and Mexico are very different from Brazil in this case, and perhaps Colombia. Now, the 19th century, I am a 20th century historian, and so I do think I have a warped view of the 19th century. And so if I'm wrong, just tell me I'm wrong and I won't be insulted. But my sense of 19th century nationalism in Brazil is it's really a passive thing. I mean, it's around the figure of the emperor, it's that we speak Portuguese. And the War of the Triple Alliance, and again, I'm not as well read on the War of the Triple Alliance as I could be, but the things that I take from the War of the Triple Alliance are more negative than positive. That you have this divide now where the military has a very different view of slavery after the war, right? And it won't chase slaves. You have the rise of republicanism coming out of that, which is rejecting what had existed. And I think, and again, I could be wrong, this is my simple-minded view of it, I think that there's a real accounting of how is it that Paraguay, that has industry, has fought so well for so long, and that why can't we be as powerful as Paraguay, right? So I think that, yeah, they win and they get territory into Mato Grosso, and lots of positives come out of the War of the Triple Alliance. And I'm sure nationalism and the military is a national institution, which is the carrier of nationalism, for better or worse. But I think that there are lots of things that cause Brazil to then look at itself and say, this is a really problematic kind of development. And the one thing I'd add to that, and again, I mentioned I'm from outside Philly, I'm fascinated by Pedro's visit to the Centennial in 1876, and he goes to Fairmount Park, and he sees all of this machinery, and I think he wildly misreads the United States, because he says, this was a slave society 10 years ago. Well, no, the North that produced all this machinery was not. But he's then questioning, the very society that he leads, both symbolically and juridically, right? So I get your point, and I could be completely wrong, because it's not, it's not something I'm very well read in. But I read the War of the Triple Alliance as kind of a victory with lots of harbingers of major change coming. Dan, you had a
Sure. So for me to say that geography, mainly Brazil's massive size, influences history, is in some ways to say that landscapes and physical characteristics of different regions constrain and shape human life. I mean, we can see that, we can say, like a very simple fact, that the Northeast is prone to droughts, or, you know, above a certain line, I think it's in Paraná, something like that, you know, you grow a line, or below the line, and then above it, you know, is coffee. And without sort of verging into Jared Diamond style, like ecological determinism.
Or worse, 19th century, you know, kind of racist geography.
Yeah,
Geography's
right.
doesn't, right.
So, but I was wondering if you could comment a little bit on how Brazil's very landscapes have shaped its history.
Right. So I guess, so on the one hand, you know, when I first studied Brazilian history many, many years ago, this was impressed upon me, the escarpment, right? And how, you know, unlike the American Piedmont, and the question of where the rivers went, right? So I grew up on the Delaware River, and then there's, you know, of course, the Ohio River and the Mississippi River and all that. So yeah, landscape's important, but my point is not about the landscape. My point is about the political context. So when you think about this trip from Oakland to New York, and how they can do that in 63 days while you can't go from Rio to Sao Paulo in, you know, half that time. You know, part of that is politics, right? That the politics of the United States mean what? It means that lots of underpopulated rural states build lots of roads, right? The Grange movement is behind this. That there is, and there's an impulse towards national integration that, you know, is the you know, I won't sing, but the Hamiltonian moment, right? And that, you know, the Hamiltonians want this. I don't know who the Hamiltonians are in Brazil, right? So when I probably said this very thing to you, that's how boring I am. So when I teach this to undergraduates, one of the things I say is, what's fascinating about, if you think about the United States, is that in 1890, if you mailed a letter from Manhattan to South Dakota, it was a letter. You paid the same amount of money as if you mailed that letter from Manhattan to Queens, right? And that part of that way the United States was organized privileged rural sectors, but what that meant is the United States used its kind of image of how it would develop to fund this infrastructure, no matter what the landscape was. Okay, so a much poorer country, Mexico, right? But Mexico has, right, its national capital happens to be in the physical center because that's where the indigenous people had their capital because, right, people would constantly come from the north and conquer Tenochtitlan. But it also meant that when finally the nation is sort of exhausted and organized in the Porfiriato, and there are these lines of trade that go north and south and east and west, that Mexico is the locus of things in a way that the Porfiriato, in order to control things, Porfirio Diaz wants railroads where you can put the federales on, that they can quell a rebellion, and regional elites will be loyal to Porfirio Diaz. You know, yeah, the national government goes out finally to Canudos, but that's nothing like the federales in Mexico. So that's why I don't think I'm talking about landscape. I'm talking about and that's why I start with the Portuguese, that the politics of how they do this, and then what people want to do, privilege individual, primarily landowners, who just want to export things. And then Vargas, to create a national nation, has to kind of really just kind of grab that whole thing and turn it, but he doesn't have the ability to. So he sets the stage, and then Kubitschek and the military really have new technologies and more money, and the military does it, you know, dictatorially, right? So, yeah.
I'm really glad that you mentioned the differences between the European powers and how they went and carved out land once they finally started colonizing. But I didn't catch the name of the researcher or book that
Yeah.
you said.
It's a woman who's now at UC Irvine, who's also was a Skidmore student, believe it or not, a John Phelan student and Skidmore, named Patricia Seed, and it's S-E-E-D, and the book is Ceremonies of Possession. And Pat is a complex individual, and I taught with her for years at Rice, and she's someone who decided that she needed to know what the Dutch did, so she learned to read Dutch. So that's the kind of intellectual we're talking about. Yeah.
I'm just curious about Brazil's inability to have a centralized system of taxes, and I'm wondering, like, given Vargas's populism and the exploitation of workers at the time, like, if you think a taxing system was possible, A, and B, like, what would that look like?
Yeah, well, you know, there are lots of things you can tax, right? So we tax income, we tax sales, you tax imports and exports. There's sin taxes, right? Alcohol and cigarette taxes. Road taxes come through the tax and gasoline, that kind of thing. You know, so Brazil has had such a terrible system of tax collection, still does, that what happens is there's so much tax avoidance that the rates need to go very high, which just encourages more tax avoidance. The issue in Brazil wasn't to tax the workers. The workers did pay a tax, the union tax, right? But it was more to tax the wealthy and the professions. So one of the things I was lucky enough to get access to was the internal minutes of meetings at the Federation of Industries in Sao Paulo. And literally they had so much money, these guys, during World War II, which was a period of great sacrifice for people, and Brazil fought in World War II, that they have this meeting in which they say no one can build a new mansion. This is really bad. This is real, the PR is terrible. They also went through and they discussed the wages they were paying, and they were like, how do people live on these wages? Now, no one had that kind of Fordist moment, like if we pay them more, they'll buy more things, right? So the tax system would have to go after people in the professions and the elite, but of course the vast majority of people are poor people and working people. So, but the point is that before the income tax in the United States, the two main national sources of revenue were the tariff and alcohol taxes. And in Brazil, the tariff was often a state tax, so you didn't even have a national government collecting money. Yeah.
I have a question about the railroads in Brazil. Who financed the construction of those railroads? You showed us a map from around 1890.
Yeah.
Who financed those? Who built them?
Yeah, primarily the English and the French, but also some Americans did. And
So that actually, I thought that might be the case.
Right.
And that leads me to the question of whether, in fact, the direction of the development of the country was really based on domestic politics and balance of power between different groups within the country, or was it really directed from outside?
yeah, so the answer is both, right? So the argument is that I
Well,
think
certainly
that,
both, but the
Right.
question is, I took your presentation to be very Brazil-centric in terms of, mostly you talked about what was happening within Brazil. And when you mentioned David Harvey, who you say you like, you say, well, Harvey is more international. I'm not so sure if that's the case, but nevertheless, some people would take a much more international perspective on the drivers in the development of Brazil. That Brazil developed to serve other interests than the interests of the people of Brazil.
right. I think, yeah, and I agree with you, Harvey, right? I mean, Harvey talks about a lot of stuff, and Harvey's written a million books. His book on Baltimore, I mean, that's not international. I take your point. So since this is a Tom Skidmore lecture, I should kind of make a kind of personal historiographical point. I went to graduate school in 1984. And I went to graduate school, and the people who influenced me the most were Tom and Steve Stern and Florencia Mallon. And they all, but particularly Steve and Florencia, were part of a generation that really rejected dependency theory, which is the extreme example of this argument. Because it, despite people like Fernando Henrique Cardoso talking about a transnational bourgeoisie, basically put the driver of history in the international economy. And I remember Steve in a way that only Steve Stern could do, because the assumption was, he said, have you read Capital? And like three of us were in a reading group, we read book 1 of Capital. He goes, no, not book 1, book 3. And we're like, no, like we're not reading book 3, And he's like, well, that's the problem with Wallerstein, is that he's a book 3 capitalist, or Marxist, and I'm a book 1 Marxist. I mean, I'm looking at production. So my kind of education was to reject that notion of the international economy as the driver. I think that I truly accept, particularly in this day and age, and I'm writing a book called The Global 20s, the importance of that. And I think that what it was, so I say both, I don't mean it as a cop-out. I mean that I look at 19th century Latin American history as a group of elites who are now freed from European control, who want to replicate the colonial economy, but with themselves in charge. So they want to produce things that they can then sell, at this point, primarily to Europe. So I don't think it's driven internationally, but I think it's driven by trade, which involves making those connections internationally. And my point is, and again, to get to Dan's, is not that that's unique to Brazil, but that Brazil's unique geography meant, and its legacy of a certain kind of colonial settlement and colonial governance meant that those lines are from commodity producing areas directly to foreign markets and foreign interlopers like or interlockers like the English in the coffee trade, rather than being connecting. But yes, there's a huge foreign component to it. It's Brazil's place in the world, and Brazilian politics are then shaping the spatial development.
But they don't, I'm sorry.
Oh, go ahead.
But the Europeans don't control the coffee
Nope.
plantations.
Nope.
The Brazilians
That's right.
do, and
That's
they,
right.
so
Right, and that's
the wealth comes from the coffee, not from the railroads.
That's right. Well, Summerhill, I think, exaggerates how much wealth is generated, or kind of productivity increased by the railroads. But absolutely, Jim, and that is an incredibly important point about Brazil. that if you compare it with lots of Latin American countries that produced minerals, right, mining or petroleum, and I don't know, I'm just gonna look at you, I mean, like how many of the sugar plantations, I know many of the mills were US owned in Cuba, right, but that's not the case in Brazil. Almost everything in Brazil of these commodities, there's lots of foreign capital backing them, but they're produced in Brazil, and there is a success story, right, that Sao Paulo's coffee helps fund Sao Paulo's industrialization, right, but there just isn't that connection, is I guess what I'm trying to say. Come on, I made a lot of big assumptions in here. You should be able to challenge more than that.
What was the thing that was most important about studying with Tom Skidmore?
What was the thing? I have a really, an answer comes to mind directly about that. That Tom was someone who was simultaneously brutal and kind intellectually. And we had a panel at the American Historical Association at Denver where a bunch of his students did remembrances, and George Reed Andrews, who's at Pitt, who's a bit older than I am, he and I were the only two who had worked with him in Madison. Everyone else had worked with him here at Brown. And Reed, he goes by Reed. Reed and I, our jaws were agape as we heard story after story of being at Tom's condo drinking wine and laughing and telling stories. And I told this story about Tom. We had to write papers that were 5.5 pages long, and in a political economy seminar. And the first 3 or 4 was my first semester in grad school. He, gave me the obligatory graduate school A, good job. And then we read Diaz Alejandro's Essays in Argentine Economic History, which I'm probably the only person standing in this room who could say, I really loved that book. It's 700 pages long. And I loved it so much I wrote a 12-page paper. And I'm reading the comments, and it's like, great, good point, great. And then on page 6, there's a red line. It says, did not read beyond here, F. And I think that was kind, because it was like, I'm your advisor, like I'm doing this in almost a parental way, like I told you to do this, and other people are gonna tell you to do this. I'm not gonna, like, this isn't a real punishment, right? So that was an extraordinary way of dealing with you. He also, when I wrote my dissertation, I don't know how you work, Jim, but he always had a red flare pen. And I talked to, yeah, right, things have changed. I understand there are different color flare pens. And I wrote that the women worked in big factories, and Tom circled big and wrote, what is big? Right, and metalworking shops were small. What is small, right? So there was always this kind of criticism that you always knew came from a great place, but that was about kind of an exactitude, that he wanted you to be exact about things. And I'll say one more personal thing, and I think Sandra had a question, is that Tom was really old-fashioned for a very deeply political liberal guy. And when you got to Madison, he was Professor Skidmore. And he was Professor Skidmore, he was Professor Skidmore. And at a certain point after you passed your exams, he was still Professor Skidmore, but suddenly he was a little chummier with you. And then he visited me in the field, and suddenly there was a little bit more gossip. And I remember after I got tenure at Williams, suddenly he really told me shit. It was kind of amazing. And I was like, well, you're the same guy. And so he just had that kind of formality that, like, you're still a pup. I can't tell you that. I'm not going to scare you off the field. And then when you had tenure, he was like, let me tell you how it really works. Sandra?
Well, I didn't, not to beat a dead horse about the railroads.
You studied Mexico.
Yeah. When I look at the map of the railroad development in Mexico and also in the United States, what I see are them developed on top of what were originally indigenous trade routes. And
That's a
that
great point.
doesn't really seem to have happened in Brazil, or did it? And I'm not sure, I don't know.
Okay, so now here's the 20th century urban historian talking about indigenous people in the colonial period. Okay, so it's all going to be great. My understanding of the vast majority of indigenous people who occupied sort of the coast where Brazil is that they were largely, and I know I'm exaggerating, but they were largely what people say semi-nomadic, right? So that they weren't completely nomadic, but they returned to areas and, they moved. Now, I don't think that's completely right. Like John Montero's work on Sao Paulo, does say, like, there's a reason there's a subway stop in the middle of Sao Paulo called Anhangabaú, right? I mean, that these are indigenous names because there really were people who were settled here. But I do think, and I'm very embarrassed, I lived in New Mexico. I'm very embarrassed to say I don't know much about the United States in this regard. But, you know, clearly the society in the Central Valley of Mexico is so much more economically developed than anything in Brazil before 1500, that there's no urban space that can compare to Tenochtitlan. There's no sense of trade and ethnic and tribal rivalry as there are between the Tlaxcalans and the people we call the Aztecs and that sort of thing. But I think that that's a really great comment. I mean, I was thinking more just like the colonial Veracruz and Acapulco, but absolutely the north-south axes. I did not know that about the United States at all. That's a fabulous comment. Thank you. So your argument is like, forget the Portuguese. It predates the Portuguese in some ways. Yeah.
But I would say that most of the railroads have to do with coffee and
And sugar.
and they're not related to commerce and populations, but just where
Yeah.
land is cleared.
Right. And indigenous people are thrown off that land.
Right.
Quite often.
And,
right.
and are using the land in a very different way, and
Right.
therefore that's, yeah, so.
Right, and again, I mean, in Mexico, and please correct me if I'm wrong, but in Mexico, where there is obviously copper and although oil, I think, is mostly on the coast, but where copper and other minerals are moved, there are lots and lots of goods, and lots of people are moving back and forth, and eventually a significant migration back and forth to the United States, right? Including the fact that obviously lots of the United States used to be Mexico. Right? So, but that's a really great point. You seem very well educated. And super smart. Don't let Sandra's brilliant comment intimidate you from making an almost as brilliant comment. No? Well, thank you very much for having me.